The wind off the Potomac carried no warmth that September morning in 1945. It cut through the wool coats of diplomats. It scattered the dead leaves across the steps of the Treasury building. And somewhere inside those marble corridors, a dying man was about to beg. His name was John Maynard Keynes. He was 62 years old. He had survived one heart attack already, and his doctors had warned him that another journey across the Atlantic might kill him. But the British government had no choice. They needed someone who could speak the language of money, someone the Americans might respect, someone who could make them understand that the greatest empire in human history was 6 weeks away from complete financial collapse. Keynes had been carried onto the Queen Mary in a wheelchair. He had spent the voyage reviewing numbers that made his chest tighten with something worse than cardiac distress. Britain's gold reserves were nearly gone. The nation's overseas investments, built over 2 centuries of imperial expansion, had been liquidated to purchase American weapons. The factories that had once manufactured goods for a quarter of the Earth's population were worn down to their rivets, their machinery obsolete, their workers exhausted. And now, with the war barely finished, with the bodies still being counted across Europe and Asia, with the victory parades not yet swept from the streets of London, the Americans had done something that Keynes could only describe as an act of calculated brutality. They had terminated Lend-Lease, without warning, without negotiation, without a single day of transition. On August the 14th, Japan surrendered. On August the 17th, President Truman signed the order cutting off all military and economic aid to Britain. Ships already at sea were ordered to turn around. Contracts were cancelled mid-signature. Factories producing tanks and aircraft for British forces received notices of termination before the workers had finished their shifts. Keynes stood before the American negotiators in that cold September morning, a cigarette trembling between his yellowed fingers, and he understood something that most of his countrymen back home had not yet grasped. The war was over, and Britain had lost. Not to Germany, not to Japan. The future of nations hung in the balance, and the men who would decide that future were not wearing military uniforms. They were wearing 3-piece suits. They carried briefcases instead of rifles. And they worked for the United States Treasury. To understand what happened in those negotiations, to understand how the mightiest empire in human history was dismantled not by enemy armies but by Allied bankers, you must first understand what the British people believed about themselves. They believed they had won. And why wouldn't they? The newsreels showed their soldiers marching through the ruins of Berlin. Their prime minister had stood defiant when all of Europe had fallen. Their cities had endured the Blitz. Their children had been evacuated to the countryside. Their women had worked the factories and driven the ambulances and buried the dead. For 6 years they had sacrificed everything. The butter, the sugar, the petrol, the nylon stockings, the sons and fathers and brothers who never came home. Britain had entered the war as the world's greatest imperial power. The sun famously never set on the British Empire because the Crown's possessions spanned every time zone on Earth. From the trading houses of Hong Kong to the tea plantations of Ceylon, from the diamond mines of South Africa to the oil refineries of the Persian Gulf, British interests dominated the global economy. The Royal Navy ruled the waves. The pound sterling served as the world's reserve currency. London's financial institutions, the Bank of England, Lloyd's, the great merchant houses of the city, operated as the beating heart of international commerce. This was the Britain that went to war in 1939. The Britain that emerged in 1945 looked identical on the surface. The flags still flew. The king still reigned. The empire still stretched across the Atlas in satisfying shades of pink. But beneath that surface, something fundamental had changed. The empire was hollow. Its treasuries were empty. Its industries were exhausted. Its debts were astronomical. And the creditors were gathering. The British people did not know this. They could not know this. The government had carefully concealed the true state of the nation's finances throughout the war because the truth would have been devastating to morale. How do you ask a population to sacrifice their sons if they know the country is already bankrupt? How do you maintain the fiction of imperial strength if everyone understands that the empire survives only on American charity? So the myth was maintained. The newspapers celebrated victory. The politicians spoke of Britain's glorious future. The crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace and cheered for the royal family, and John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship to Washington to negotiate the terms of his country's surrender. The reality was simple, and it was devastating. Britain had not financed the war through taxation or domestic production. Britain had financed the war by selling everything it owned. Before the United States even entered the conflict, British agents had been dispatched across the Atlantic with orders to liquidate every asset they could reach. Shares in American companies that had been accumulated over generations of investment. Real estate holdings, patent rights, manufacturing subsidiaries. All of it was sold, often at distressed prices, to raise the cash necessary to purchase American weapons and supplies. This was not Lend-Lease. This was the period before Lend-Lease, when the Americans insisted on cash payment for everything. Cash and carry, they called it. And Britain carried until its pockets were empty. When Lend-Lease finally began in March of 1941, it came with strings attached that the British public never fully understood. Yes, America would provide the tanks and planes and ships that Britain needed to survive. But in exchange, Britain agreed to conditions that would reshape the post-war world entirely. The most important of these was Article 7. Article 7 of the Lend-Lease Agreement required Britain to work toward the elimination of trade barriers and discriminatory practices in international commerce. This sounded reasonable. It sounded like a shared commitment to free markets and open economies. In practice, it meant the dismantling of imperial preference. Imperial preference was the system of tariffs and trade agreements that bound the British Empire together economically. It gave British manufacturers privileged access to colonial markets. It gave colonial producers privileged access to British consumers. It created a closed economic system that excluded American competition. The Americans had been trying to break this system for decades. The war gave them the leverage they needed. Every crate of Spam, every Sherman tank, every gallon of aviation fuel that kept the Royal Air Force in the sky came at a price. And that price was the future of British economic independence. But even Lend-Lease was not enough. By 1945, Britain had accumulated what economists called the sterling balances. These were debts owed to the countries that had supplied Britain with goods and services during the war, countries that were technically part of the empire but had been promised payment in return for their contributions. India alone was owed over £1 billion. Egypt was owed hundreds of millions. The Middle Eastern territories that had provided oil and strategic bases had been promised compensation that London could not afford to pay. Britain ended the war as the world's largest debtor nation. The total debt approached £21 billion, a sum so vast that it represented more than twice the nation's annual economic output. And then the Americans cut off the money. Keynes arrived in Washington expecting gratitude. He expected the Americans to remember that Britain had stood alone against Hitler when the rest of Europe fell. He expected them to acknowledge that Britain had bled and burned while America remained neutral. He expected, at minimum, a gift, a grant of $5 or $6 billion to help an ally recover from its sacrifice. What he found instead was a negotiating table. Across from him sat Harry Dexter White, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. White was a New Dealer, a technocrat, a man who viewed international economics as a chess game and America's moment of supremacy as an opportunity that might never come again. He was polite, he was patient, and he was utterly without sentiment. White understood what Keynes understood, that Britain had no alternatives. The British government could not return to London empty-handed. The factories would close. The food imports would cease. The empire would collapse in a matter of months. Britain needed American money, and America was the only country on earth that had money to give. This was not an alliance. This was a foreclosure. The negotiations dragged on for weeks. Keynes argued, pleaded, deployed every intellectual weapon in his considerable arsenal. He invoked the shared sacrifice of the war. He warned of the consequences if Britain fell into economic chaos. He appealed to the long-term interests of Anglo-American cooperation. White listened, and then he presented the terms. America would provide a loan of $3,750 million. Not a gift, a loan, with interest, and with conditions that would accelerate the destruction of British imperial power. The first condition was convertibility. Within 1 year of the loan taking effect, Britain would be required to make the pound sterling freely convertible into dollars. This meant that anyone holding pounds, including the countries to which Britain owed those massive sterling balances, could exchange them for American currency at will. The second condition was the end of imperial preference. Britain agreed to participate in negotiations that would systematically dismantle the tariff walls protecting its colonial trade. The third condition was the opening of British markets to American goods on terms favorable to American producers. Keynes understood immediately what these conditions meant. They meant that Britain would not be allowed to recover in its own time, according to its own priorities. Britain would be integrated into an American-led economic order on American terms. He cabled London with the details. The response was despair. But there was no choice. On December 6, 1945, the Anglo-American Loan Agreement was signed. Britain received its money that would have to be repaid with interest over the next 50 years. The final payment was not made until December 29, 2006. 61 years after the war ended. 61 years of debt service to an ally. Keynes returned to London a broken man. He died 4 months later. The dismantling of British power was systematic, and it was deliberate. Consider what was taken. The first sacrifice was invisible to most observers, but it was perhaps the most devastating of all. During the years before Lend-Lease, when Britain was paying cash for American weapons, the Churchill government had been forced to sell its direct investments in American industry. The Viscose Company, American Thread, Lever Brothers subsidiaries, Courtaulds American Holdings, Brown and Williamson Tobacco. These were not abstract financial instruments. These were income-generating assets, built over decades, that provided Britain with a permanent stake in the American economy. Every year, they produced dividends that flowed back to British shareholders, strengthening the pound and providing capital for further investment. The Americans required Britain to sell these assets as a condition of receiving war supplies. The sales were often conducted at distressed prices under time pressure to American buyers who understood exactly how desperate the sellers were. It was like watching a family sell the furniture to pay for medicine. Except the family was an empire, and the furniture could never be replaced. The second sacrifice was the naval bases. In September of 1940, more than a year before the United States entered the war, Churchill agreed to what was called the Destroyers for Bases deal. America would provide 50 obsolete destroyers, ships that the U.S. Navy no longer wanted, in exchange for 99-year leases on British bases throughout the Atlantic and Caribbean. Bermuda, Newfoundland, Jamaica, Trinidad, British Guiana. These were not minor concessions. These were strategic positions that Britain had held for centuries, positions that controlled shipping lanes and commanded approaches to the Western Hemisphere. They were the physical infrastructure of naval supremacy. Churchill called it a good deal at the time because he had no choice. The destroyers were needed. The bases were the price. But what was really happening was the transfer of hemispheric control from London to Washington. The American Navy moved into British bases while British power retreated. The Atlantic became an American lake. The third sacrifice was the most consequential of all, and it occurred not through a single treaty but through a process so gradual that many people failed to recognize it until it was complete. The loss of the Middle Eastern oil. Before the war, British companies, particularly the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become BP, dominated the petroleum industry across the Persian Gulf. British diplomats had carved up the region with France in the 1920s. British troops garrisoned the strategic points. British engineers operated the refineries. But the war shifted the balance. American oil companies, backed by the State Department, expanded aggressively into Saudi Arabia during the conflict. The Arabian-American Oil Company, Aramco, established itself as the dominant force in the world's largest petroleum reserves. And as British power weakened, American influence filled the vacuum. By 1950, the United States controlled more Middle Eastern oil production than Britain. By 1960, the ratio was overwhelming. Oil was not just a commodity. Oil was power, and the power was flowing west across the Atlantic to a new master, What did victory feel like for the British people? Felt like hunger. Rationing, which had been accepted as a wartime necessity, did not end with the peace. It intensified. In 1946, bread was rationed for the first time, something that had never happened even during the darkest days of the Blitz. The bread ration was followed by potato restrictions, then further cuts to meat allowances. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was one of the coldest in recorded British history. Coal supplies, already inadequate, collapsed entirely. Power cuts became routine. Factories closed because there was no fuel to run them. Unemployment, which had been negligible during the war, spiked toward 2 million. People froze in their homes. This was victory. The humiliation was compounded in the summer of 1947 when the convertibility clause of the American loan took effect. Britain was required to make the pound freely exchangeable for dollars, just as the Americans had demanded. The result was catastrophic. Everyone who held pounds, especially the countries that were owed those massive sterling balances, rushed to convert them into dollars. In just 6 weeks, the entire proceeds of the American loan were drained from British reserves. The money that was supposed to finance years of reconstruction vanished in a single financial panic. Britain was forced to suspend convertibility. The loan was gone. The conditions remained. And the Americans made clear that there would be no further assistance without further compliance. The ordinary British citizen did not understand the mechanics of convertibility crises or sterling balances. What they understood was that the war was over, they had won, and yet somehow their lives were harder than ever. The children who had been promised a better future after the sacrifices of war grew up in council flats with inadequate heating. The workers who had manned the factories that produced Spitfires found themselves unemployed or underpaid. The women who had kept the country running while the men fought were expected to return to domestic life without question. Rationing did not end until 1954, 9 years after the war. 9 years of queuing for basic necessities. 9 years of making do with less. Germany, the defeated enemy, recovered faster. By the early 1950s, the German economic miracle was transforming the bombed-out ruins of the Reich into gleaming prosperity. Former Nazis were building Volkswagens while victorious Britons were counting their sugar allowances. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, provided substantial aid to Western Europe. But its primary beneficiaries were the continental nations that had been occupied, not the island that had never surrendered. Britain received less, proportionally, than France or West Germany. The Americans were not punishing Britain exactly. They were simply indifferent to British suffering. They were building a new world order, and in that order Britain was no longer central. Britain was merely useful. The final humiliation came in 1956. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, nationalized the Suez Canal. The canal had been operated by a company in which the British government held a controlling stake. It was the vital artery through which Middle Eastern oil flowed to European markets. It was, in many ways, the last great symbol of British imperial power in the region. Prime Minister Anthony Eden decided to act. In coordination with France and Israel, Britain launched a military operation to seize the canal and depose Nasser. The troops performed brilliantly. The operation was a military success. And then the phone rang in London. President Eisenhower was on the line. The Americans were not pleased. The United States had not been consulted about the operation. Eisenhower was furious that his allies had destabilized the Middle East at a moment when the Cold War with the Soviet Union required Western unity. And he had the means to make his displeasure felt. The Americans refused to support the pound on international currency markets. Without that support, the pound's value collapsed. Britain faced a choice: withdraw from Suez or face complete financial ruin. There was no choice. British forces retreated. Eden resigned in disgrace. And the world understood, finally and completely, that Britain was no longer an independent great power. The empire had been hollowed out over the previous decade. But Suez was the moment when the hollow core was exposed for everyone to see. Britain could not act in its own strategic interests without American permission. Britain could not defend its own investments without American approval. Britain was, in effect, a client state. The The special relationship, so often invoked by British politicians, was revealed as a relationship between unequals. America led, Britain followed, and any deviation from American wishes would be punished swiftly and mercilessly. The decolonization that followed was not a graceful withdrawal. It was a fire sale. India had already been granted independence in 1947, not from idealism but from exhaustion. Britain could not afford to maintain control over a subcontinent that was on the verge of civil war. So the British left and partition followed and millions died. After Suez, the remaining colonies fell away with increasing speed. Ghana, Malaysia, Kenya, Nigeria, the Caribbean territories. Each departure represented a loss of resources, markets, and strategic position. Each departure was accompanied by rhetoric about freedom and self-determination. But the truth was simpler. Britain could not afford its empire. The Americans did not want Britain to have an empire. And so the empire ended. Who won the Second World War? The question seems absurd. The Nazis were destroyed. The Japanese militarists were defeated. The concentration camps were liberated. The Allied powers triumphed over some of the most evil regimes in human history. But within the Allied coalition, there were winners and losers. The Soviet Union won territory, half of Europe fell under its control, along with vast resources and populations. The price was measured in millions of dead. But power was gained. The United States won everything else. America emerged from the war with the world's largest economy, the world's most powerful military, the world's only atomic weapons, and effective control over the global financial system. The dollar replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. American military bases replaced British naval stations across the globe. American corporations moved into markets that had been closed to them for generations. This was not accidental. It was policy. The men who shaped American strategy during and after the war understood that the conflict presented an opportunity to restructure the entire international order. They were not evil. Many of them genuinely believed that American leadership would be better for the world than the old European empires. They thought that free trade would bring prosperity. They thought that the Bretton Woods system would provide stability. They thought that a Pax Americana would prevent future wars. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the American century that followed was, on balance, better than the alternatives. But that does not change what happened to Britain. Britain paid the price of victory. Britain lost its investments, its markets, its currency supremacy, its military independence, and ultimately its empire. Britain emerged from the war victorious in name and ruined in substance. The British people were not told this at the time. They were allowed to believe that they had won a great victory, and that the sacrifices had been worthwhile, and that their country remained a major power. The truth emerged slowly, over decades, through humiliations and declines that each seemed explicable on its own terms but that together formed an unmistakable pattern. And the money tells the story. Follow the money from the Lend-Lease termination to the Anglo-American loan. Follow the money from the sterling balances to the convertibility crisis. Follow the money from Suez to the pound's devaluation in 1967. Follow the money to the final loan payment in 2006. The trajectory is always the same. The flow is always in the same direction. From London to Washington. From the old empire to the new. There is a photograph from December of 1945 that few people remember. It shows Lord Keynes at the signing ceremony for the Anglo-American loan agreement. He is seated at a long table covered with documents. American officials surround him. The flashbulbs are popping. Keynes is smiling. The smile is thin. His face is gray with exhaustion. He has spent months arguing against terms that he knows will cripple his country, and he has lost every argument that mattered. But he signs. What else can he do? Behind him, unseen in the photograph, is the future. The bread rationing. The coal shortages. The convertibility disaster. The retreat from empire. The Suez humiliation. The decades of managed decline. And behind the Americans, equally unseen, is their future. The Marshall Plan. The NATO alliance. The Vietnam War. The oil shocks. The defeats and triumphs of a nation that had inherited the earth. Wars are not won on battlefields alone. They are won in conference rooms and treasury departments and banking halls. They are won by the people who control the money, who set the terms, who decide which debts will be called in and which will be forgiven. Britain fought the war. Britain bled for the war. Britain endured the bombs and the blockades and the terrible grinding attrition of 6 years of total conflict. But when the fighting stopped, Britain had nothing left to bargain with. The factories were worn out. The investments were sold. The gold was gone. The debts were enormous. And the Americans held all the leverage. What happened next was not cruelty. It was not revenge. It was not even particularly personal. It was business. The Americans saw an opportunity, and they took it. They extracted concessions that their fathers and grandfathers could only have dreamed of. They pried open the British Empire and claimed its markets for themselves. They replaced the pound with the dollar and London with New York and the Royal Navy with their own fleets. They did it all with handshakes and signatures and polite diplomatic language. And Britain signed every document, accepted every condition, made every concession, because there was no alternative, because the money was gone, because the empire was already dead, and all that remained was to negotiate the terms of the funeral. Walk through London today and you will see the monuments to imperial greatness still standing. The statues, the grand buildings, the museums filled with treasures from every corner of the world. But the power that those monuments represent has not existed for 70 years. The children who grew up on ration books in the late 1940s are now in their 80s. The soldiers who marched victorious through Berlin came home to a country that could not feed them properly. The empire their parents had taken for granted dissolved in a single generation. And in Washington, the men who negotiated the loan are long dead, but the system they built endures. The dollar still rules. American military bases still span the globe. American financial institutions still dominate international markets. This is the legacy of the Second World War. Not just the defeat of fascism, though that defeat was real and necessary and good, but also the transfer of global hegemony from one English-speaking empire to another. Britain paid for the victory. America collected the proceeds. This is not a story of villainy. The Americans did not set out to destroy their ally. They simply recognized that the ally was already destroyed, and they ensured that the pieces fell in ways that benefited American interests. That is what great powers do. That is what Britain would have done, in different circumstances, to any rival foolish enough to become dependent on British capital. The strong do what they can. The weak suffer what they must. Britain had been strong for 2 centuries. In 1945, Britain became weak. And the Americans were waiting. The last loan payment was made on December 29, 2006. 61 years after the signing. 61 years of interest payments flowing across the Atlantic. 61 years of remembering, with every scheduled transfer, that victory had come at a price. The payment was for $83 million. A small sum in the context of modern government budgets. The British Treasury announced it without ceremony. Few newspapers covered the story. But consider what that payment represented. It represented the end of a debt incurred when Clement Attlee was Prime Minister and Harry Truman was President. A debt incurred before the Cold War had fully begun. A debt incurred when India was still under British rule and the Marshall Plan had not yet been announced and the world was still reeling from the devastation of global conflict. Generations of British taxpayers had contributed to that debt. Generations of British governments had allocated funds to its service. The money had flowed continuously, through boom and recession, through political changes and social upheavals, from an exhausted empire to a triumphant republic. And when the final payment cleared, nothing much happened. No ceremonies, no acknowledgments, no special relationships reconsidered. Just an entry in a ledger, marking the end of a transaction that had begun before most of the world's current population was born. Follow the money. It will tell you things that the history books leave out. It will show you alliances that were never truly equal and victories that were never truly won. It will reveal the cold arithmetic behind the warm words of friendship and solidarity. Britain won the war. Britain lost the peace. And the ledger books in Washington recorded every penny of the price.